I became a raging works righteousness person, in the sense that I took being a Christian as my thing. Everybody had a thing back in the 60s, early 70s. You were into rock and roll or drugs or peace marches or whatever. Well, I was the Christian. That was what made me special.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
Kathy Keller, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Ruth.
Now, Kathy, I want to start by voicing what I imagine many others will also want to ask, which is how you and your family are and whether there's anything we can be praying for you.
We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of Tim's death next month, about 3 weeks. And the boys all want to be together, and I wasn't going to actually mark the day with any special observance. I mean, every day is partially a hard day and partially a joyful day. The joyful part is just imagining Tim completely joyful and healed and happy and whole and at rest and in glory. And then I didn't wish him back for anything. And then the part where I go off and cry into my pillow is where I miss him. And it's just hard, you know. But I have a friend who's been widowed for 10 years. And she says she's still getting what she calls sideswiped. You know, she'll pick a book off the bookshelf and it'll have his notes in the margins or something like that. And, you know, she'll find herself in a puddle. So I don't expect that to go away. And I know we're gonna talk about C.S. Lewis later. There's a part in Out of the Silent Planet when Ransom escapes from his captors, and he's running through the forest, the pink forest, and he thinks he's hallucinating, and he decides to handle it by just sort of stopping and letting it roll over him until he calms down, and then he just goes on. And I sort of adopted that as the philosophy. This is going to roll over me and I'll be fine. So
Thank you so much for sharing so beautifully. We will be praying for you. And I know there's lots of people all across the whole world that are praying for you and your family. Now, Kathy, I've come across so many stories in the last year of people who have been deeply, deeply impacted by Tim, Redeemer, you, City to City. I know there's a whole area on the Gospel in Life website where people have got the opportunity to share their story if they want to. But is there anything that you have heard that's particularly encouraged you and your family since Tim's death back in May?
There are so many stories, and they all sort of start to merge together. I get the email traffic that comes in on correspondence at gospelandlife.com. So I hear regularly from all sorts of people with all sorts of stories. But one woman in particular is a widow herself, and she just says, you know, I don't know what I would do without hearing Gospel in Life and being reminded that grace is supreme. Grace is supreme. I mean, the thing that I've said to the staff when we had the 25th anniversary of the church, which was 10 years ago, it's 35 this year. And we were starting to work into breaking up in Mama Redeemer into 3 separate sites, and now there are 5 or 6 maybe, was that you'll see it's not Tim Keller, it's the gospel. It's the power that drives all this. Everyone thinks it's Tim's amazing preaching, which Tim did have an amazing gift that God had given him. But that's not the power. The power is the preaching of the gospel. One of Tim's most important mentors was Ed Clowney, who used to be the president of Westminster Seminary. And have you met Ed? Did you meet him before he died? Do you know him?
No, I didn't. I didn't, sadly.
He was probably 90 pounds soaking wet, as they say over here in the States. He looked like a strong wind could blow him away. And when he would start to preach, you know, his specialty was biblical theology. He would sort of go here and go there and go somewhere else. And then suddenly he'd pull it all together and you'd start weeping because, there was the power and the glory of the gospel. And, he didn't thunder. He didn't exaggerate. He was an academic through and through and through. And right on the spot, the first time he came to the seminary where Tim and I were attending, he and I and one of our friends, David Midwood, who actually is the man who died and widowed my friend, formed the Edmund P. Clowney fan club. And to belong to it, you had to believe he was the best preacher that you ever heard. And by any standards that are taught or preached or written in books about preaching, Ed didn't have any of them, but he had the truth. And when he made it shine, you wanted to fall on your face and cry holy. And an awful lot of the stories that come in about, oh, Tim changed my life and Tim did this and Tim did that, we both felt was partly a misunderstanding. It was the gospel that changed their life. And Tim was clearer than most maybe, at explaining that, but that didn't make him the author of the gospel. It made him just a communicator of the gospel.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really helpful clarification. And as you say, that is the thing that keeps coming through time and time again when you read things about Tim, is that, yeah, as you say, it didn't point to Tim, it pointed to the gospel. Now, Kathy, we're going to talk a little bit more about Tim and the amazing impact he's had. But one of the things I love to do when I have people on my show is to go back to the beginning of their lives and just piece together just a tiny little bit about how you ended up where you are. Don't worry, we won't dwell too long. I know both you and Tim, neither of you like talking about yourselves, which is testament to how incredible you are. But would you just take us back a little bit to the beginning of your life? I mean, what was your experience of God as a child? Would you share just a little bit about your faith journey, if you would?
Oh, my. Yeah. I was the oldest of 5 children, and we were taken to a local liberal Presbyterian church for Sunday school and church, because that's what you did back in the 50s. Nobody took it very seriously, and it wasn't something you talked about, or we weren't involved in the church in any other way. But I had sort of stumbled across C.S. Lewis books. We lived in an unincorporated township outside of Pittsburgh, and that meant that we didn't rate a public library, but there was a thing called a bookmobile, which was a school bus that had been painted green, and the librarian/driver would show up with the bookmobile in the parking lot of the local shopping center, and on Wednesdays, as I recall, and you could check out books, take them home, read them, and I would always get things from the fantasy, the hero. I was reading Ulysses. I was reading King Arthur. Any of the mythologies, etc. I came across one and I liked it, and I went back to the librarian at one point and said, "I read a really good book. I'd like to read it again. It's had a witch in it, and I think a lion." And she said, "Oh, I know which one that is." So she got it for me, and then we were off. Narnia became my favorite set of books, and after a while, I started getting the point that he was trying to say Aslan was Jesus, but in a different world. And I kept thinking, well, maybe he thinks so, but obviously that's not right, because Jesus is boring and he walks around and gives sermons, and, he's not this warm, vital, active, powerful figure. Obviously, Lewis is barking up the wrong tree. He had the wrong, but I saw what he was trying to say, especially by the end of Don Treader, where he makes that very, very plain. And what was difficult, though, is the books were very, very slow to cross the Atlantic, and it was a thrill nobody had ever heard of him. I would go to libraries and there'd be a card catalog and they would have somebody named Sinclair Lewis. Nobody ever heard of C.S. Lewis. So I guess I developed the idea that he wasn't very well known. He was like a struggling author. And So I read everything that I could get my hands on, stuff that was very inappropriate for my age. I was 12 and reading Screw Tape and Mere Christianity and that sort of thing. Didn't really have any other Christian input.
I read something where you had a sick dog and you prayed. And I think that was such a powerful story.
Yes.
Would you mind sharing that, Kathy?
Well, no, I wouldn't. God works with the thing that is going to be most powerful in your life. And for all that I had all of my siblings, I had 18 local cousins that lived in the area that were always in and out of our house, neighbors, that sort of thing. The being that I loved the most and who loved me unconditionally was my beagle named Pepper. And she developed a degenerative disease of the spine where um, her discs were slipping down and severing her spinal cord. So she was getting increasingly paralyzed from her hindquarters forward. And I heard my father talking with my mother. I mean, he had grown up in an immigrant coal patch. And what you did when you had a sick animal, you took responsibility for it. But that meant you took it out in the back and shot it and then buried it in the garden. And I knew that this was going to be Pepper's fate pretty soon because she was just in pain all the time and sort of hauling herself by her front paws. It was the first time I tried to pray. And the only prayer I knew was the Lord's Prayer. So I would race through Our Father in heaven, hallowed be the name of the King, and get to the end and then start crying and saying, please make my dog better, make my dog better, make my dog better. One night I was trying to do that and I felt like I ran into a brick wall when I got to Thy Will Be Done. It was very, very odd. I've never had an experience before or since. It felt like there were big spotlights on me, like that guy in the Kafka story, glaring at me, and that I had to decide then and there for the rest of eternity whether it was thy will be done or my will be done. And of course, if I said thy will be done, the only thing that God ever wanted to do was just get his clammy hands on your life so that he could ruin it and make you a single missionary with a pith helmet and send you off to a jungle somewhere. And, that was to be the rest of your life. So I struggled and struggled and struggled. It seemed like the longest time. I have no idea how much time passed in real life. And finally I broke down and I said, okay, thy will be done, knowing that I had signed my dog's death warrant. And only time this has ever happened inside my head, I heard, it's not your dog's life I wanted, it's your life. So I got out of bed and I ran down to the basement where she was sleeping in a box instead of outside in her doghouse and said, you're going to be all right. You're going to be all right. And God wasted a perfectly good miracle on healing the dog. I worked for the veterinarian the next summer, actually. And he said, well, sorry about your dog. When did she die? And I said, oh, she didn't die. My dad took her hunting last fall. No. He said, nerves don't regenerate. He said, I have the x-rays. And I said, well, I have the dog. So, the thing about that story, though, is that it was fairly content free. I felt that God had claimed me and that something very significant had happened, that I was now in some way connected to God that I hadn't been before, but I didn't have any information about that. I didn't know anything about being a sinner, about Jesus having to die as our substitute, about God, loving me and providing a way for me to join him in heaven. Nothing. No one ever said a word about that. And reading Lewis actually didn't help because he was all about the apologetics. He wasn't about teaching you how to be a Christian, how to read your Bible, how to pray. I kept thinking, well, where am I going to learn that? So I didn't learn it. That was the problem. I went off to college and took all the religion courses I could take until I realized that they weren't going to help me become a Christian. They were there to deprogram me from my ridiculous Christian beliefs and make me an atheist. So then when I decided, I'm going to go to seminary, I'm going to be a minister, I didn't see why not at that point. And they'll teach me how to be a Christian. And in truth, I finally got some content that I was a sinner and that there was substitutionary atonement, which once I heard the doctrine of substitutionary atonement, the fireworks went off. Oh, I get it. I see why he died. He died in my place. I get it. But nobody's ever sat down and told me how to read my Bible, how to study my Bible, how to have a prayer life. That was just not, it kind of got passed over. And it's taken decades to repair that lack. I mean, what happened actually is I became a raging works righteousness person, in the sense that I took being a Christian as my thing. Everybody had a thing back in the 60s, early 70s. You were into rock and roll or drugs or peace marches or whatever. Well, I was the Christian. That is what made me special. And although it was my identity, it was an external identity. It wasn't an identity that came from an internal change, if that makes any sense.
That totally makes sense. And I guess seminary was so significant in so many ways. We're going to talk a little bit about your change of theology around women ordination, but it was also where you met Tim, wasn't it?
No, not exactly. I had met him many times before. He went to the same college as my sister Susan, and he was a leader of their intervarsity group, and she was sort of an unwitting go-between. She would come back and she'd say, Tim Keller's reading this book on prayer by O. Hallisby. And I'd say, And I would go out and buy it and say, yeah, it's a pretty good book. And she would go back and tell Tim, my sister's going to go to Gordon Conwell Seminary. And he'd say, oh, I haven't ever heard about that because it was brand new then. I'll look into it. And, without us ever actually speaking to each other. And then R.C. Sproul opened the Ligonier Valley Study Center in actual Ligonier Valley, which is a part of Pennsylvania, which was equidistant from my home to the west and Tim's home to the east. So in the summers, when we came back from college, we would go to their gab fests, is what R.C. would call them, where anybody could toss him any question. And when you introduced yourself, I'd say, I'm Kathy Keller. I'm on my way to Gordon Conwell Seminary. And Tim would nod from across the room. He was sitting with his friends. And when we got to him, he would say, I'm Tim Keller. I'm going to Gordon Conwell Seminary. And I'd nod to him. But someone who is a very faint acquaintance becomes a very good friend when you're 600 miles away from everybody else you've ever met. So we got to be friends once we got to seminary, but we had actually met each other a number of times before then.
And you and Tim had been married for 48 years. I mean, obviously you have written lots about this, particularly in The Meaning of Marriage and A Seal Upon the Heart. But is there any advice? I mean, I'm aware that 48 years of marriage gives a lot of advice, but is there any nuggets of wisdom that you would give to a couple who are just starting their marriage journey together?
Well, I guess my top couple pieces of advice would be learn your loved one's love language. We've heard of books about love languages. I'm sure you're aware of them. R.C. Sproul, who performed our wedding, did very little in the way of marriage counseling, but he did tell us this. He said, I like extravagant gifts, and I was hoping that I would get new golf clubs for my birthday. But instead, my wife, Vesta, who likes practical things, gave me 5 white shirts. So when her birthday rolled around, remembering that I like extravagant things, I gave her a mink coat when she was actually hoping for a new washing machine. So you can miss each other. You can be speaking love. You can be trying to show love to another person. But if you don't realize that their love language might be words of affirmation and encouragement, and instead you're being helpful, which can translate as critical, as it did in our marriage. Here, just let me show you where the potholes are in that plan, and let me help you tone it up a little bit. And here, I can edit that for you. when what he needed was encouragement and, that was a great idea, honey. And, that'll make a big difference. And then maybe offer a little bit of advice. But so learn your loved one's love language and then use it. Never pass up a chance to tell someone that you love them, to affirm them, to encourage them, um, and not demand that they let you into their secret heart, but to tell them that you love them no matter what's in their secret heart. That you're not, trying to catch them out and say, are you thinking that you wish that you weren't even home with the kids, that you were out with your buddies, or it would be, gee, honey, I know it's hard. Being around the kids all the time is really difficult, and I know you'd like to have a night out. And you can just phrase things so differently if you give it half of a thought. I would just say those would be my major things. Tim and I used to quote John Newton's words all the time, that the biggest danger of a happy marriage is idolatry. But I had no idea how true that was until Tim was gone, and there was this big hole in my life where I had put Tim instead of Jesus, where his just day-to-day presence there was the comfort and the security that I should have been finding in Jesus, but I wasn't. I was finding it in Tim. So that may sound like a joke, biggest danger of a happy marriage is idolatry, but it's really no joke. It can be a very dangerous thing to do, and you have to keep, this falls into the category of a third piece of advice, keep your own relationship to Christ warm and alive, and not rely on the person that's loving you for all the love that you feel that you need. You need to get that love from God.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources, and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.